I've always been a sucker for a good deal, especially when it involves old furniture that has some character to it. So when I saw the listing on Craigslist for a free antique wardrobe, I didn't think twice about the 40-minute drive into the rural outskirts of the county. The ad was sparse, just a single grainy photo of a dark, towering wooden piece and a short description stating it was free to anyone who could haul it out of the basement themselves. I just moved into a drafty pre-war apartment that was severely lacking in closet space, and the thought of a solid oak wardrobe for the price of a tank of gas seemed like a godsend. I sent a quick message to the seller, a man who identified himself only as Arthur, and he replied almost instantly with a set of directions that were surprisingly specific for such a remote location. The drive took me past the familiar rows of suburban strip malls and deep into the patchwork of overgrown farmland and dense, unmanaged woods, where the GPS signal started to flicker and die. By the time I turned onto the gravel driveway of the address provided, the sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long, skeletal shadows across the yard. The house was a massive, weathered Victorian with peeling white paint and shutters that hung at odd, neglected angles like broken limbs. I pulled my truck up to the side of the house as instructed and sat there for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled, feeling a sudden, inexplicable weight in the pit of my stomach. There was no sign of life anywhere, no cars in the driveway, no lights in the windows, just the sound of the wind whistling through the tall grass. I told myself I was being paranoid, that old houses always look a little creepy at dusk, and that I was lucky to be getting such a beautiful piece of history for nothing. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching loudly under my boots, and walked toward the back of the house, where a small, hunched figure was standing by a set of storm cellar doors. Arthur was older than I expected, dressed in a heavy wool coat that seemed far too warm for the evening, and his eyes were obscured by thick, yellowed spectacles. He didn't offer a handshake or even a greeting. He just gestured toward the open cellar doors and muttered something about the wardrobe being in the back room of the basement. The air coming out of the cellar was unnaturally cold, smelling of damp earth, stale cedar, and something else I couldn't quite place, something sickly sweet like rotting fruit. I followed him down the steep wooden stairs, which groaned under our weight, my hand trailing along the rough, sweating stone walls of the foundation. The basement was a labyrinth of low-hanging pipes and cluttered shelves filled with dusty mason jars, their contents unrecognizable in the dim light of a single flickering bulb. Arthur moved with a surprising, silent agility, leading me deeper into the house until we reached a heavy oak door at the very back of the basement. He fumbled with a ring of keys, his fingers trembling slightly, and pushed the door open to reveal a room that was surprisingly clean compared to the rest of the cellar. There it was, standing in the center of the small, windowless room, a magnificent wardrobe that had to be at least 7 feet tall. Its dark wood, polished to a mirror-like sheen, it looked completely out of place in this damp, subterranean environment, looking more like a museum piece than something someone would just give away on the internet. I walked around it, running my hand over the intricate carvings of vines and flowers that adorned the doors, feeling the coldness of the wood beneath my fingertips. Arthur stood by the door, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the floor, watching me with an intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I asked him if he had any dollies or straps to help move it, but he just shook his head and said the wardrobe was actually lighter than it looked. I opened the heavy doors to check the interior, expecting to see empty shelves or hanging rods, but the inside was lined with thick, quilted velvet that seemed to swallow the light. As I leaned inside to check the stability of the back panel, I noticed a series of faint, rhythmic scratches on the inner floor of the wardrobe, as if someone had been trying to dig their way out through the wood. A cold shiver raced down my spine, and I started to pull back. But before I could react, I heard the heavy thud of the room's door swinging shut. The sound echoed through the small space like a gunshot, followed immediately by the unmistakable grinding of a deadbolt sliding into place. I lunged for the door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and grabbed the handle, twisting it frantically. It wouldn't budge, the solid wood feeling like a part of the stone foundation itself, immovable and indifferent to my mounting panic. I hammered on the door, shouting for Arthur to open up, telling him it wasn't funny and that I just wanted to leave. From the other side of the wood, I heard a soft, wet sound, like a heavy sigh, followed by the slow, retreating footsteps of the old man. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear anything, but all I could catch was the faint, muffled sound of a heavy metal bar being dropped into place on the outside. My breathing came in ragged gasps as I realized that the room was completely soundproofed. The thick stone walls and the heavy door insulating me from the world above. I turned back to the wardrobe, the only other object in the room, and noticed for the first time that there were no hinges on the outside of the doors anymore. I reached out to touch the polished wood again, and my hand brushed against a small, hidden latch near the base that I hadn't seen before. I flicked it, and the entire wardrobe shifted, sliding forward on hidden tracks to reveal a small, dark crawlspace behind it that led even deeper into the earth. The smell of rotting fruit was overwhelming now, thick and cloying, rising from the blackness of the hole behind the furniture. I realized then that the wardrobe wasn't the prize. It was the bait. A beautiful, shining thing used to lure people into a space where they could be easily contained. I looked back at the door, then at the dark hole, and then at the interior of the wardrobe with its velvet lining and those frantic scratch marks. My phone was in my pocket, but when I pulled it out, the screen showed no service, just a mocking emergency calls only message that I knew wouldn't go through. I sat down on the cold floor, the silence of the basement pressing in on my eardrums until it started to sound like a high-pitched ringing. Minutes turned into hours, and the single light bulb overhead began to dim, the filament glowing a dull, angry orange before finally flickering out. In the absolute darkness, the sounds of the house above seemed to amplify: the creaking of floorboards, the distant thumping of something being moved, and the muffled sound of a car engine starting in the driveway. I realized, with a jolt of pure terror, that Arthur wasn't staying. He was leaving, and he had no intention of ever coming back for me. I began to feel around the floor, my fingers brushing against something hard and cold near the corner of the room that felt like a discarded set of keys. I grabbed them, my hope surging for a fleeting second, until I realized they were rusted shut, fused together into a useless lump of iron. I crawled back to the wardrobe, the only thing I could find in the dark, and climbed inside, pulling the heavy doors shut behind me out of some primal need for a barrier. The velvet was soft against my back, but as I settled in, my hand hit the back panel, and it swung open easily into that dark crawl space I'd seen earlier. I didn't want to go in there, but the thought of sitting in the dark waiting to starve was worse. So I began to crawl, the rough earth scraping my palms. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders, and it sloped downward at a steep, dizzying angle. After what felt like miles of crawling through the damp dark, the tunnel opened up into a larger cavern, and I felt the air shift, becoming even colder and more stagnant. I reached out, my hand hitting something soft and yielding, something that felt like heavy fabric draped over a frame. I fumbled for my phone, using the dim light of the screen to see, and the breath left my lungs in a silent scream. The cavern was filled with them, dozens of wardrobes, some antique and beautiful, others cheap and modern, all arranged in neat, orderly rows like a graveyard of furniture. Each one was closed, but as I panned the light around, I saw that they all had the same heavy metal bars across the doors, bolted directly into the stone. From inside the nearest one, I heard a faint, rhythmic scratching sound, the exact same sound I had heard back in the room. I stood frozen, the light of my phone reflecting off the polished wood of 100 different traps, realizing that the free listings had been posted for years. I walked to the nearest wardrobe and tried to pull the bar off, but it was set deep into the rock, immovable and permanent. A voice, thin and cracked with age, whispered from inside the cabinet, asking if I was the one who had come for the mahogany piece. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was tight with a dry, metallic taste of fear that made it hard to swallow. I turned to run back to the tunnel, but as the light of my phone swept across the far wall, I saw a heavy steel door, the kind used in bank vaults, standing wide open. I scrambled toward it, thinking it was an exit, but as I crossed the threshold, I realized it was another room, identical to the one I had just left. On the floor of this new room lay a fresh Craigslist printout, the ink still smelling of the printer, detailing a free antique vanity available for pickup. I heard the steel door behind me begin to hiss, a hydraulic hiss that signaled it was closing, and I knew I had triggered a sensor. I lunged back, but the door was faster, sealing with a vacuum-tight thud that left me in total, absolute silence. Once again, there was no light bulb in this room, no wardrobe to hide in, just the cold floor and the smell of mothballs. I felt around the walls, searching for a latch, a crack, anything. But the stone was seamless and cold. I realize now that Arthur isn't just a man. He's a collector. And he's very, very patient with his inventory. I can hear the sound of the hydraulic system resetting, a distant hum that vibrates through the floor and into my bones. Somewhere above me, I know another ad is being posted, another must-see deal that someone else is currently scrolling past on their lunch break. I wonder if they'll bring a friend, or if they'll be like me, arriving alone at dusk with dreams of a beautiful piece of history. My phone battery is at 3% now, the screen flickering as it struggles to stay alive in the damp air. I'm riding this down not because I think anyone will find it, but because the silence is so heavy, I need to feel like I'm still speaking to someone. The scratching has started in this room now too, but it isn't coming from me. It's coming from underneath the floorboards. I don't want to know what's down there, but the floor is starting to feel very, very thin. The light is almost gone now, and I can hear the sound of a key turning in a lock that shouldn't exist in a room this deep. I think the wardrobe is moving again, the heavy wood sliding across the stone with a sound like grinding teeth. I should have just bought something new from a store, but the allure of the old and the free was too much to resist. Now I'm just another piece of the collection, waiting for the next person to come and try to take me home. The door is opening now, just a crack, and I can see a sliver of yellow light from a pair of thick spectacles. Arthur is smiling, and he's holding a polish rag in one hand and a heavy, jagged piece of metal in the other. He tells me I'm going to look beautiful once I'm properly finished, and I believe him. I really do. I was 3 months behind on rent, and the eviction notice was already taped to my door when I found the ad on Craigslist. It was buried under a pile of scammy-looking data entry jobs and roles that paid in exposure. But the headline stopped me cold. It simply said, "Night sitter needed $500/night." And I figured it was either a typo or something incredibly illegal. But I was desperate enough to click. The description was oddly brief, stating that a homeowner in the hills needed someone to stay in their guest suite from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., just to ensure the property wasn't empty. There were no kids to watch, no pets to feed, and the only requirement was that I had to stay for a full week. I emailed the address provided and got a response within 10 minutes, asking me to come for a walkthrough that very evening. The house was a sprawling, brutalist concrete structure perched on a cliffside, surrounded by dense trees, and a gate that looked like it belonged to a high-security prison. Sterling, the owner, was a thin, jittery man who spoke in quick, clipped sentences and wouldn't make eye contact with me. He gave me a tour of the kitchen and the living room, which were filled with expensive-looking minimalist furniture that looked incredibly uncomfortable. Finally, he led me to a heavy steel door at the end of a long hallway near the kitchen. He pointed to a small keypad on the wall and told me that this led to the basement and that I was never, under any circumstances, to go down there. He then pointed to a small alcove adjacent to the door, which he called the security nook. It contained a desk with several blacked-out monitors that he claimed were for off-site professional surveillance only. He emphasized that looking at them or touching the equipment would void our contract and lead to immediate termination without pay. He handed me a thick envelope containing the first night's pay in cash, which was more money than I'd seen in a year. I told him it sounded like the easiest job in the world, and I didn't care about his basement at all. He didn't smile. He just handed me the keys and told me he'd be staying at a hotel in the city for the duration of the week. The first night was surprisingly boring, which was exactly what I had hoped for. I spent most of my time on the oversized velvet sofa, scrolling through my phone and eating the expensive snacks I'd brought from the gas station. The house was dead silent, save for the occasional groan of the central heating and the wind whipping against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I found myself wandering near the basement door once or twice, mostly out of habit because it was right next to the pantry. I could hear a low, rhythmic thrumming sound coming from behind the steel door, like a heavy-duty server rack, or maybe a large industrial freezer. It wasn't loud, just a constant vibration that I eventually tuned out as I settled back into my phone. Around 2 a.m., I noticed a faint blue glow coming from the security nook Mr. Sterling had mentioned. It was just a small alcove with a desk and several standby lights, and I made sure to walk past it with my eyes fixed firmly on the opposite wall. I felt a little silly being so obedient, but for $500 a night, I was willing to be the most compliant employee on the planet. I fell asleep on the sofa around 4 a.m. and woke up to the sun hitting the glass, feeling more refreshed than I had in weeks. Sterling didn't come back to check on me. He just sent a short text asking if everything was secure. I told him it was, and he told me to return that night at exactly 10 o'clock. The second night felt a little different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on the source of my unease. The silence of the house seemed heavier, and I found myself checking the locks on the front door 3 or 4 times before midnight. Every time I passed the security nook, the blue glow of the standby lights on the monitors seemed a little brighter in the dark hallway. I started hearing sounds that didn't quite fit the profile of a settling house, like the soft, rhythmic tapping of something against wood. It sounded like it was coming from beneath the floorboards, right under the kitchen island where I sat to drink my coffee. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the pipes, or maybe a stray branch outside catching the wind. At 3:15 a.m., I heard a very distinct click come from the direction of the basement door. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs, and listened as the thrumming sound changed pitch, becoming a low, wet, mechanical whine. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring at that steel door, half expecting it to swing open and reveal someone standing there. Nothing happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer the only person in the house. I stayed in the guest suite for the rest of the night, with the door locked, staring at the handle until the sun came up and signaled my shift was over. By the third night, my curiosity had turned into a gnawing, anxious knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I told myself that Sterling was probably just running some kind of illegal crypto farm, or maybe he had a high-end grow op down there. But the sounds were getting more frequent, muffled thuds, the scrape of metal on concrete, and once a sound that remarkably resembled a human cough. I knew I should just leave, but I needed the money for the rest of the week to stay afloat and pay off my debts. Around midnight, the power flickered for a split second, and the monitors in the security nook hummed to life on their own. I didn't mean to look. I really didn't. But as I walked past to get a glass of water, the sudden flash of movement caught my eye. There were 4 screens, and they weren't showing the exterior of the house or the hallways like a normal security system. They were all pointed at the guest suite, where I had been sleeping for the past 2 nights. One camera was hidden in the smoke detector, another was behind the vent, and a third was positioned inside the closet. On the 4th screen, I saw a live feed of the basement itself, and my breath hitched in my throat. It wasn't a server room. It was a small, soundproofed chamber with a single chair and a row of monitors identical to the ones upstairs. Sitting in that chair was Mr. Sterling, and he wasn't looking at a computer screen or a television. He was staring directly into a camera that was mounted right above the monitors I was currently looking at. In the live feed, I saw him lean forward and pick up a headset, his eyes wide and bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept in days. Then the speakers in the security nook crackled to life, and I heard his voice, distorted and wet, coming from right behind me. "I told you not to look at the monitors, David," he whispered, his voice echoing both from the speakers and from the hallway floorboards beneath my feet. I realized then that the thrumming I'd heard wasn't a machine. It was the sound of him breathing into a microphone for hours. I turned around slowly, and the basement door, which had been locked every night, was standing wide open. I didn't wait to see him emerge from the darkness of the stairwell, or hear whatever else he had to say. I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the heavy deadbolts, while I heard the sound of heavy footsteps sprinting up the concrete stairs. I managed to get the door open and ran for my car, not even looking back until I was through the front gates and a mile down the road. I drove straight to the police station, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the steering wheel when I finally got them to go back to the house with me. The gates were locked, and the entire place was dark and silent. There was no Mr. Sterling, no furniture in the living room, and no monitors in the security nook, just empty rooms and the smell of stale cleaning supplies. The police told me the property had been in foreclosure for months and was currently owned by a holding company out of state. I still have the envelope of cash he gave me on the first night, but I can't bring myself to spend a single cent of it. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that rhythmic thrumming sound in the back of my mind, and I wonder how many other houses he's sitting in right now. I moved to a different city 3 weeks ago, but yesterday I found a Craigslist ad for a high-paying night job in my new neighborhood. The wording was exactly the same, right down to the specific rule about the basement monitors. I haven't left my apartment since I saw it, because when I looked out the window this morning, I saw a thin, jittery man standing across the street near a utility van. He wasn't looking at the house or the street. He was just staring at the vents on the side of my building with a headset around his neck. I checked my own smoke detector an hour ago, and there is a tiny glass lens reflecting the light back at me. I'm sitting in the dark now, listening to a low thrumming coming from the floorboards, and I realize I never actually quit the job. He's just changed the location of the office. I've always been a bit of a digital scavenger, spending my late nights scrolling through the for sale sections of local classifieds. There's something addictive about finding a high-end piece of tech that someone is selling for a fraction of its value. Most of the time, it's just people who don't know what they have, or maybe they're just desperate to pay their rent by the first of the month. Last Tuesday, I saw a listing that seemed almost too good to be true. An iPhone 14 Pro Max for $300. The description was sparse, just saying works fine, minor scratches, need cash fast. I messaged the seller, a guy who went by the name M.R., and he responded within seconds. He wanted to meet at a gas station on the edge of town, a place that felt a bit too isolated for my liking. But the price was too tempting to pass up. I pulled into the lot at 10:00 p.m., the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing with a dying, rhythmic hum. A beat-up sedan was parked near the air pump, and a man in a bulky gray sweatshirt stepped out as soon as I killed my engine. He didn't say much, just handed me the phone and watched me with a strange, intense focus while I checked the screen. The phone felt heavy and cold in my palm, much heavier than I expected. I handed him the $300 in 20s, and he pocketed the cash without even counting it. "Make sure you sign into your own account right away," he said, his voice raspy, as if he hadn't used it in days. Before I could ask him anything else, he hopped back into his car and sped off, leaving a cloud of exhaust hanging in the cool night air. I sat in my car for a moment, looking at the device, feeling a strange sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. I drove home, the silence of the car feeling heavier than usual, and headed straight to my office. I plugged the phone into my computer to start the setup process, expecting it to be completely wiped. To my surprise, the phone didn't go to the hello screen. It opened straight to the home screen. It looked empty at first, but as I poked around, I realized he hadn't actually erased the data. He just deleted the apps. Deep in the settings, under the privacy and location tab, I found something he'd forgotten to clear. The significant locations history was still active, and it was filled with months of data. I knew I should have just hit the erase all content and settings button right then and there. But curiosity is a powerful thing, especially when it's 1:00 a.m. and the house is quiet. I started looking through the map, seeing where R had been over the last few weeks. Most of it was mundane stuff: a local gym, a grocery store, a coffee shop. But there was one address that popped up every single night around 3:00 a.m. It was labeled work, but it was in a residential neighborhood that had only recently been built. I noticed that the cloud sync was still active, tethered to a secondary account that hadn't been logged out because I was on my home Wi-Fi. The phone started pulling in new data from that account's history. Suddenly, a notification appeared at the top of the screen. New location shared. My heart skipped a beat as a live map opened up, showing a pulsing blue dot. It wasn't R.'s old house. It was a completely different location, miles away from the gas station where we met. I watched the dot, mesmerized by how smooth its movement was as it traveled down a main artery of the city. It was 1:30 a.m. now, and I felt a strange, voyeuristic thrill watching this stranger move through the world. The dot eventually slowed down and stopped at a house at the very end of a dark, wooded road. I zoomed in on the satellite view, seeing a sprawling estate tucked away from its neighbors. For some reason, I felt a desperate need to see this place for myself. I told myself it was because I wanted to make sure I wasn't being tracked by the phone I just bought. I told myself I was being a detective, uncovering some kind of mystery. But deep down, I knew I was just being pulled in by the darkness of the hour. I grabbed my jacket and headed back out to my car, the air feeling significantly colder than it had an hour before. The streets were completely deserted, the traffic lights blinking yellow at empty intersections. I followed the GPS on my own phone, which was mirroring the location I'd found on the Craigslist phone. As I got closer to the wooded road, the streetlights began to disappear, replaced by the dense, overhanging branches of ancient oaks. The road transitioned from asphalt to gravel, and the sound of my tires crunching became deafening in the silence. I turned off my headlights as I neared the final turn, relying on the pale moonlight to guide me. The house finally came into view, a massive, modern structure made of glass and dark wood. It looked completely dark, except for a faint blue glow coming from one of the upper floor windows. I pulled my car onto the shoulder of the road, hiding it behind a thicket of bushes. My breath was shallow, and I could feel the pulse in my neck thumping rhythmically. I picked up the Craigslist phone, checking the live location one more time. The blue dot was perfectly centered on the house. But then it did something strange. It flickered, disappearing for a second, before reappearing much closer to the edge of the property. I looked out the window, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. I didn't see anything, but I heard the distant, sharp snap of a dry branch. I froze, my hand hovering over the door lock. I told myself it was just a deer or a stray dog, but the sound was too heavy, too deliberate. I looked back down at the phone, and the blue dot had moved again. It was now sitting directly on the road, maybe 50 feet behind my car. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as the realization hit. The significant location wasn't the seller's home, it was the phone itself, and it was being tracked by someone else. I looked in my rearview mirror, but the darkness was absolute. I fumbled for my keys, my fingers feeling like lead. Then the phone in my hand buzzed with a notification. It was a photo, a thumbnail showing a dark interior. I tapped it, and the image expanded to fill the screen. It was a photo of me, sitting in my car, taken from the perspective of the bushes I was currently parked next to. The photo was time-stamped 30 seconds ago. I realized then that I wasn't the one doing the tracking. I had been lured. I slammed the car into gear and floored it, the gravel spraying behind me as I tore down the road. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just needed to get back to the main road. As I reached the end of the wooded path, I checked the mirror again and saw a pair of headlights snap on behind me. They were bright, blindingly bright, and they were gaining on me fast. I pushed my car as hard as it would go, the engine screaming in protest. I reached the highway and swung the car onto the pavement, the tires chirping as they found grip. The car behind me didn't slow down, keeping a perfectly consistent distance of about 20 feet. I tried to dial 911 on my own phone, but the screen was frozen on the Craigslist phone's sync interface. Both of my phones were now acting as one, their screens locked in a loop. A message appeared across both displays. You forgot to sign out. I threw the Craigslist phone out the window, watching it bounce and shatter against the asphalt in a shower of sparks. I hoped that would end it, that the tracking would stop once the device was destroyed. But the headlights behind me didn't fade. They stayed right there, a constant, menacing presence. I drove for miles, weaving through side streets and doubling back, but I couldn't shake them. Eventually, I realized I was running out of gas, the low fuel light glowing a mocking amber on my dashboard. I pulled into a well-lit 24-hour diner, thinking that the presence of people would keep me safe. I parked right in front of the windows and sat there, waiting for the other car to pull in. It didn't. It parked across the street, its headlights still aimed directly at me. I ran inside the diner, the bell on the door ringing with a cheerful sound that felt completely out of place. The waitress looked up from the counter, her expression bored and tired. "Can I help you?" she asked, not noticing the sheer terror on my face. I tried to speak, but my throat was so dry I could only manage a raspy whisper. "I think someone is following me," I finally gasped out. She looked out the window at the car across the street and shrugged. "They're just parked there, honey. They aren't doing anything illegal." I sat in a booth, watching the silver sedan through the glass. I waited for an hour, sipping on a cup of coffee that I couldn't taste. The car didn't move, and no one got out. Finally, around 4 a.m., the headlights flickered twice and then went out. The car slowly pulled away, disappearing into the pre-dawn mist. I stayed in the diner until the sun came up, feeling a small sense of relief as the world began to wake up. I eventually worked up the courage to walk back to my car, my eyes scanning every shadow. When I reached the driver's side door, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Tucked under my windshield wiper was a small, handwritten note on a piece of yellow legal paper. It said, "The sink works both ways." I unlocked my car and climbed inside, my hands trembling as I reached for my own phone. I went to my iCloud settings, desperate to change my passwords and log out of everything. But when I opened the Devices tab, I saw a new entry that hadn't been there before. It was labeled MRS tablet, and it was currently listed as active. I realized with a jolt of horror that by plugging that phone into my MacBook, I hadn't just looked at his data. I had given his account permission to access mine. I started getting notifications on my screen photos from my own library being uploaded to a shared folder. Photos of my family, photos of my house, photos of my keys. I tried to delete the account, but it said access denied, managed by administrator. I looked up and saw a silver sedan drive slowly past the diner again. This time, the driver didn't look away. He stared right at me and smiled. I've moved 3 times since that night, and I've thrown away every piece of technology I own. But every time I get a new phone, no matter how much I protect it, a single notification eventually pops up. It's always a map, showing a blue dot that's exactly 10 feet away from wherever I am standing.